Now, growing up in the South at the time that you grew up, to envision yourself as an author, who was that inspiration? Was it Tony? Was it Zora? Was it Alice? Who or was it somebody else?
Well, growing up, I didn't know anything about a Toni Morrison, right? I didn't know anything about a Alice Walker. They didn't teach those writers in school. There was no, now a lot of high schools have African American history. My high school didn't have anything like that. My parents were not literary people, so they didn't know anything about a Toni Morrison. I didn't encounter those women until college. So when I was growing up, I read, things that books you could find in the supermarket. So my mother and I would go to the grocery store, and while she shopped for groceries, I'd go over and look in the book. So I was reading like Jackie Collins, Sidney Sheldon, any kind of book you could find in the supermarket. Stephen King, I read when I was
Yeah,
little.
I was just thinking Stephen King, Judy Krantz. Man,
Yeah,
that was a little racy, this little romance stuff.
that's
Judy
right.
Bloom. Yes, go
All
ahead.
of those. And so I didn't really get exposed to Black writers until college. And that was a revolution for me because I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe there were these writers I'd never even heard of.
All right, so Memphis, right? To
Yes.
Harvard, to Harvard.
Yes.
Memphis. What was that? All right, because again, no exposure to the history and all. You end up at Harvard from Memphis.
No, and I was country. I got there and they talked about me because I was wearing fishnet pantyhose with my shorts, walking across campus with like boots on. And so I got there and, that was my first exposure in the North. And I had, a thick accent and, but it was a revolution for me I became an African American, at that time we called it Afro American Studies major, because I just couldn't get enough. I wanted more. I just wanted to read all the Black literature, all the Black history I could get. It was all new to me. I came out of public schools in Memphis. I was in a strong public school in Memphis, but there was no African American literature or African American history in my high school.
So what was the first book that you said, "Oh my goodness, um, what have I been missing?" What was that first book?
Probably The Color Purple by Alice Walker. I had seen the movie, but I had never, like a lot of people, we see the movie before we read the book, but I had never really understood her as a writer. And so I read The Color Purple and I was blown away. And then I read some other Alice Walker books. I read The Third Life of Grange Copeland. The first time I read Toni Morrison, I didn't understand her. She was very difficult.
Same. I often tell the story of Beloved because I was an English major and I was like, she can't write. That's how ignorant I was at 18, 19. Like, why is she getting Pulitzers? Like, the hell is she talking about?
Yeah.
But I went back in my 20s. I was like, no, she's just too erudite for me. Came back in my 30s and was like, she's a mother freaking genius. Oh my God, she's a genius.
She's the queen. She's the
oh
queen.
my God,
Forever
genius.
queen.
Genius. All right. So Winch, that's the first time I met you. That was your first book?
Yep, that was my first book.
Okay. What inspired that? Because that story, and I've, that trauma porn label, because I feel like, you can be successful in this country if you bring us back to the old South that people love. And I'm talking about other people, people without melanin. They love that period of time, which is why Mammy can win an Oscar. You understand? Like it's
That's right.
something about.
When I published that book, there was a lot of what I called slavery fatigue. People didn't want to read about it anymore. People wanted contemporary stories. As you know, Terry McMillan had brought us into contemporary Black women's stories in a way unlike any other. She revolutionized publishing. To me, she's a living legend.
Yes.
So when I came on the scene, that was what people wanted to read. They wanted to read more contemporary type fiction. But I was really interested in history and I wanted to write about Black women's friendships during that time because I thought there were still some stories from that time that we hadn't been told yet. And so I wanted to read about Black women talking to each other and being friends with each other and sustaining each other. And at the heart of that book is a friendship between four women.
Yes. And there's always a betrayer among us. But that's neither here nor I don't want to give away too much. Y'all got to read that for yourself. but as you are now developing, then you get the 12 years a slave. I think Dawn did that over after Amistad, when she came over to Simon and Schuster. You
Correct.
did that there. And so when would you tap for that, and what were you thinking? Like, okay, now I'm the slavery go-to person.
Well, Dawn asked me to do that because she knew that she just asked me to write an introduction. They were publishing a special edition, and it was going to be a limited hardcover edition. She wanted me to write the introduction because she thought I might be able to add some perspective as a woman, as a historical fiction writer, as a PhD. And I was really happy to do it because that's a remarkable book. It reads like fiction, but it is not fiction. And there was also a lot of dispute about whether or not he actually wrote it. And I wanted to address that and clarify that this was his language.
Please tell us. We're talking with Dolen Perkins Valdez, and I read the book because it's public domain. It was public domain, and you could read it for free. And so I was miffed at the movie, which won, an Academy Award for, I think, Best Picture that year, or And I was like, the relationship between Solomon Northup and his wife and his children, it was more focused on, him running away and Brad Pitt, but the relationship, which is when he got snatched, it was so gut wrenching, because that this was a fully formed human being who was, successful and loved and loving and had this relationship. And then they take you through the movie to the end, sort of like that Celie, at the end when Celie and Nettie comes back and they Mama Bubba, that scene at the end. It's like, no, there's so much more that y'all didn't focus on in this movie. So tell us about Solomon Northup in the way that I think people who only watched the movie the way you saw The Color Purple would not understand unless they read the book.
You're absolutely right. The biggest outrage, other than the fact that they stole him and forced him into enslavement, was the devastation of his family. He was, like you say, he was a family man. He was married. He had children. He had been born free. He lived as a free person. And the sort of devastation of that was that after he returned, after he did eventually win his freedom, he was a changed man and was never quite able to reclaim the kind of familial happiness that he had had before. It really devastated his life. Of course, the good news is that he did manage, out of his own intellectual prowess, he did manage to escape slavery, and he did manage to secure his return. But to me, the biggest outrage was against the family, which I think is sort of just one in a long line of assaults against Black families.
I was just going to say, Dolen, that was a 12-year interruption. What does a 400-year interruption look like? That was a 12-year interruption. He could not get it together, or couldn't get back to a place where the family could, come together. What does a 400-year interruption look like?
It looks like mass incarceration. It looks like sentencing discrepancies. I mean, we just heard Judge, soon to be Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson, having to defend her sentencing record when all she was doing was trying to fairly sentence people, and based on the guidelines even that she had been given. So I think a 400 interruption looks like, healthcare inequity, which is what my newest book addresses. It looks like structural inequities, poverty. All of these things first hit Black families as family units.
So let's talk about Civil Townsend, Montgomery, Alabama. Let's talk about this book, Take My Hand, and the inspiration for it, Dolen.
So this book is set in 1973, Montgomery, Alabama, and it's about a young nurse who's just finished Tuskegee nursing school and has her first job at a family planning clinic. She wants to help women in her community have more reproductive control over their lives. But very soon she finds out that the clinic is not doing the work she thought it was doing. And she learns that there are two young girls who are her patients, 11 and 13 years old, who've been put on birth control. And one of them, the 11-year-old, has not even begun her cycle yet. And Sybil discovers this very early in the book, and she cannot believe it.
So what are they doing, putting an 11-year-old who has not had her period on birth control? We have to read the book to find out. Dolen Perkins Valdez.
It's not a spoiler. It's early in the book. They have her belief, the main character, is that no one ever asked. They assumed. I think Black children are often cast as older than what they are when they're just children, particularly Black boys, but Black girls too. And so they assumed that she was on her cycle. And they also assumed erroneously that she and her sister were sexually active, and neither of them has ever even kissed a boy. So it begins with her learning that that clinic, which is government funded, that has been put in this Black community, is hurting people. And these people are trusting them and believing that they're helping, but actually they're not.
The book is called Take My Hand. Dr. Dolen Perkins Valdez. Let me be respectful, because to go get that PhD from George Washington. No, I'm going to do that because you went and did that, Dr. Dolen. What inspired you to do this particular book, and then talk, because there's a lot of people listening who, folk want to be writers, and there's a lot of writers listening. Your process, because I feel like anytime you put something out into the universe that's going to be there forever, it's your responsibility to make sure that there is something of value in that. Whether it's Confessions of a Video Vixen, that's a book that I did, which if you read it, there's something of value in it, because I think it's important. Even if I'm an ancillary participant or a ghostwriter, I'm going to make sure there's at least 2 or 3 kernels of knowledge or power in those books, because they're going to be there forever. This is an important topic that we're suffering with right now. But it's different than the other books that you've done, which have been mostly, harkening back to enslavement in some way, or, that kind of that period of time. What was the impetus for this one?
Well, I really just try to follow my curiosity. I was really curious about this moment. It's inspired by this real life court case, Ralph v. Weinberger, and the lives of 2 actual little Black girls who were sterilized without their family's consent. Minnie Lee and Mary Alice Ralph, who were in real life, they were 12 and 14. And I began by just thinking, I wanted people to know about it. Not enough people knew about this. At the time that it happened, it was all over every major newspaper in the country, from the New York Times to the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune. It was in Jet magazine, that was what we read back in the 70s. It was in all the major publications, this story about these 2 girls. But yet so many of us now don't know about the case. It set a precedent for the rise of informed consent laws. But also, I know that there are still women now who are being sterilized without their consent. Most recently in California state prisons, we learned that there were women, primarily of color, Black women, who had been sterilized without their consent. And that has been proven to actually be true. But there's also been allegations of immigrant women in detention facilities who are being sterilized without their consent, allegedly. So I believe that some stories just need to be told. Some people need to hear this that don't know about it. And that really motivates me to write.
How do you come across a case like this? Is it in your studies? Like, what were you reading to come across Ralph, R-E-L-F versus Weinberger? And in that first sentence, those names are there and their ages, and it's stunning. It's stunning.
It's really stunning. And the interesting thing about it is it's everywhere. It's not a hidden secret. Like if you were to Google my first book, Wench, about the resort in Ohio where they vacationed. You wouldn't find very much because that was sort of hidden in the archives. But this case is all over. If you Google this, it's all over the internet. It's all over YouTube. It's, if you're watching a documentary, quite often they will flash footage of those sisters because there's lots of archival film of them. And it was always sort of a side note. It never received the kind of central attention that the Tuskegee syphilis experiment did. We've seen the Tuskegee syphilis experiment on screen. We've seen the movie. We know a little bit about it. Most of us know a little bit about it if we don't know all the details. But this kind of thing was always sort of a passing note. And I believe that's often the case for Black women's histories, that Black women's histories aren't often centrally located when we talk about Black history. And so for me, I saw it everywhere. And then one day I thought, I need to write about that. And then I thought maybe somebody's already written about it, but no one had.
That's amazing. All right. So we're going to read it. And I'm to novel. I love your writing style, first of all.
Thank
you. You can write your ass off, Dolen Perkins Valdez.
Well, I don't, I'm a very different writer than somebody like a Toni Morrison, right? Like when I first read Toni Morrison, I didn't understand her. Now she sets the gold standard for all of us writers because she changed the form. My writing is, I like to think of myself as a kitchen table writer, right? And I do literally write at the kitchen table. That's sometimes the only place to find in my crazy house. But I want everybody to be, there's nothing inaccessible or difficult about my work. Like anyone can read it. I write for everyone and I don't, at all try to make it more difficult or try to talk more eloquently than I need to get my point across. I write plain. As my grandmother was saying.
I mean, but that is, that is the way you should write. Everybody, and I'm not, and when you said that Toni Morrison is the gold standard, she is an absolute genius, but that was her style. And I think everybody has their own style. I often will buy books if I'm writing something to grab onto, because there are elements in these books that make them successful. So you should master the format. But find your voice in the format. Find your voice in the format because everything is formulaic, right? Just got to find your fingerprint.